Thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll go ahead and get started while people are coming in. That's not a typo up on the slides. The F stands for flow, is in dataflow. Also stands for fun. We're going to have some fun today. And we have 40 minutes and a lot to get through. So let's dive right in. I know it's the last day of the conference. I'm sure everybody is tired of PowerPoint presentations. I know I am. So I have one slide that we're going to switch over to a demo and spend most of the time in the demo. We'll break stuff, fix stuff, hopefully leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So Apache NiFi Registry, if you haven't heard it, it's the community solution to solving the enterprise SDLC problem. So if you're a longtime user to NiFi and you've used older versions and you had trouble migrating flows across environments, NiFi Registry is the solution you should be looking at for a better experience. Or even if you're new to NiFi and you love the UI, it's really fun to get started and build data flows. But then you're wondering, OK, when I'm done with this, how do I send it to another environment and run it someplace else? If that's not intuitive, hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have the idea. So NiFi Registry is a separate service. It runs outside your NiFi. One or more NiFis can connect to it. This is really important for SDLC, right? Think about how you do SDLC on other parts of your infrastructure. So code artifacts might live in a Nexus repository. Source code might live in Git, but it's something that's external to the system that you're running from, right? That makes it really nice and portable, so you can move it to environment as environments come up and down. But the artifacts are external and centralized. That's what Registry gives us. It has deep integration with NiFi. This is really important. So before NiFi Registry, you could build your own solution with things like templates or the REST API, and people have done that. There's community solutions for how to deploy a flow from a template to an instance of NiFi. But with the deep integration we get with NiFi Registry, we can solve this in one step, all the business logic of how to successfully diff flows change from one version to another version in the right sequence so that you're going to be most successful. It's really easy. And it's built with the enterprise in mind. So again, NiFi Registry is designed to solve the enterprise SDLC problem. So the design, the architecture of Registry itself, it's designed with the enterprise in mind. That's for things like security. It's very flexible how you can secure it for authentication, authorization, things like extensibility. If what comes out of the box isn't quite suitable for your deployment environment, there's extension points so that hopefully you can integrate with the other systems you need to. So that's NiFi Registry. We're going to go right into a demo now. So in this demo, we're going to have 3 environments. And the scenario that I put together is one of an enterprise that is rolling out a fancy new event pub/sub system. Might be based on a messaging system such as Kafka, where you have services and applications publishing events, consumers taking those events down, processing them, doing analytics. But of course, this is a realistic enterprise example. So there's legacy applications that are not publishing to Kafka. They're still writing events to a log file in a CSV format. It's not quite what we need. So we're going to use NiFi in this case to help bridge those legacy applications to be producers to our Kafka bus until they can be updated to publish natively. It's a little bit of a simple example, but the interesting thing is not the flow itself. It's about how we make changes to the flow and move it from one environment to the other. All right, so let's go right into that now. OK, so I'm running all those environments and a NiFi Registry instance on my laptop. They're on different ports, which is probably going to be too hard to see if you're trying to keep track of what environment I'm in as I switch back and forth. I do have the banner to help people. That's a label on the canvas, but it might disappear if I drill into process groups or leave it. So you can also keep an eye on the lower left-hand corner. If you don't know, NiFi has these breadcrumbs, and the top-level breadcrumb has been labeled with the name of the environment. So you should be able to keep track of where I'm at. All right, so we're in development, and this is my flow. It's this process group right here that I've been working on to solve this problem. The other stuff on the canvas is not part of my flow. It's just the test data flow that I've put together around this to test my logic. So let's drill into that and see what it's doing. This was an initial proof of concept take that I put together to solve this problem. It's based on split text that's going to load those CSV files and split them so I can do the transformations I need to do, enrich the records. and then transform them to JSON and merge them back together. It's not the best approach, and in this demo, we're going to explore a better approach. So if you're looking at this and thinking, I have a similar problem, don't copy what I'm doing now, copy what I'm doing later. But this was a proof of concept, which of course meant it got shipped to production already, and now I'm worried about scalability problems. So I'm going to improve it and then get my improved version out to production safely. All right, so I started playing around with a different approach here. Now the main downside in my approach, it's doing the correct logic. It's been working well for a while, but I'm just worried about scalability, mainly that, with that split text at the beginning, a CSV file is coming in, and every line is going to become a new flow file. So that's a lot of overhead in the system. Then I'm doing my transformations on each file individually, transforming it to JSON at the end, and merging it back together. It's kind of manageable in terms of I can follow what the logic's doing here. If I look at each one of those steps, it's a small amount of work. It makes sense. So the main problem I'm trying to solve is really the performance. And I found a much simpler way to do it with just a couple processors. So relatively new to NiFi are processors called record processors or record-oriented processors. If you're not familiar with them, you should really check them out. If you have any type of structured record-oriented data in your flow files, more than one record inside the contents of the flow file, chances are these are something that you should be using in your flows. So they allow me to do things like lookups, transformations, queries, filters, all sorts of great stuff in a record-oriented fashion without splitting into individual flow files, right? So if a CSV flow file comes in, I can do a lot of mutations on it without having to split it into individual lines of text that I then manipulate. They're really powerful, and you'll see a huge performance boost if you move from not using record processors to using them. So this is how they work. This is how I'm able to do all that in one step. So I can, the one thing, there is a little bit higher bar entry to using these. It's structured data, and to get the benefits of the record processor, I do have to define a schema. So I've defined a schema. I did it just, there's a lot of ways to do it. I did it just, I know the schema, the data I'm working with. So I just wrote an update attribute strip that's going to write the schema as an Avro JSON blob to an attribute of the flow files as they come in. There's a lot of ways you can get schemas into your NiFi instance. This is just one simple way. And then in the update record processor, I'm using some record readers and writers that are going to leverage that schema to interpret the data and transform it. So to do the CSV to JSON transformation, all I had to do was wire up a CSV reader that knows that schema and a JSON writer. That's going to do that transformation. And I'm actually able to do my enrichment inline as well because this is an update record processor. I can write a new value to the path. So I'm adding a new top-level field, full user. That's a concatenation of a user ID, an @, and the domain they're in. This is just enriching my data to make it easier for my downstream consumers to get. So pretty simple example here. I want to test this out. So I'm going to take my existing flow, which is running right now. You can see everything's green. So I'm going to stop a couple things just so that I can move connections around. So I'm going to take the input, and I'm going to drag it over to the input over here. One thing to point out is I'm reusing this connection. I'll explain why that is important in a second, but just notice that I just repointed it to where I want the data to start flowing. I didn't delete a connection and create a new one. That's kind of important. Then I'm going to wire the output over to my success point here for success. And update record can fail, like if I got a path wrong in my record schema. So I need to route failure. Now, one thing I could do that would be kind of cool is I could actually route this from the output here back to my old data flow. So if the new logic failed, it would just kick those unmodified files over to the old flow. They'd keep going. But I'm going to have a chance to test this, so I'm just going to route that to failure if it doesn't work. And then I'm going to test it, make sure everything's working. I think that should be fine. Now, at this point, I have my new flow wired. I'm not sending data into the old path, but I'm going to leave it around for a while. This is something that's kind of nuanced, but it's something you learn with experience of playing with NiFi Registry and using its ability to update flows in process as they're running without stopping them. So when I deploy this flow to production, remember, the old version's already running in production, which means all the connection queues you can see here, data in the processors, they might have data in them that they're processing at the time I deploy my new flow. So just for this version, I'm going to make a small change to reroute data to the new path, but I'm going to leave everything else in place so that when I deploy the new version, it's not a breaking change. New data that comes in the input will go to the new path, but anything that's in the old path will filter out, right? And then essentially those will be empty forever. So OK, let me go ahead and try this. I'm going to start everything back up. And I'm inside a process group. I have my test harness on the canvas. So I'm going to start seeing how things are flowing here. I can see that if I do some refreshes here, I'm going to keep an eye on the stats that are going through this success route. And if I want to just verify that nothing's going to failure, I can stop both of these and keep an eye at what's happening with the queues here. So stuff's going to queue up in the success and failure outputs of my process group. And I can see I have one success and no failures. So I think that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and send this to production. OK, so I'm going to start everything back up again. And now I'm going to make a new version. Now, if you haven't seen NiFi Registry before, one thing you can do is you can look at local changes before you commit. So I can see that I've created a couple components since I last versioned this flow. I made some connections between them, and I changed that connection destination, right? OK, that looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and save that. Updated to use record processors. And save. I can see the icon on my process group change to a green check mark, indicating that my local copy is in sync with what NiFi Registry has recorded. And I can actually go over and verify that in the NiFi Registry UI. This is what it looks like if you haven't seen it. That was the initial version that I had saved there that you see on the screen right here. And if I refresh this, I can now see a new version was saved a few seconds ago, and it has my commit message. All right, that looks good. Now I want to deploy it to staging. Now, I have a staging environment that I use for integration testing. So it's wired up to some other systems. It has data that is closer to production. I'm going to show how I got that. But first, to do the deploy. So in the NiFi UI, you can, of course, do this process manually. But we're talking SDLC. We want to double down on automated deployments and repeatable processes. So I've got some scripts to take care of this for me. So I have this flow deployment script, deploy flow version. And you can see it has a usage. It just takes two inputs, the version that I want to deploy and the environment that I want to go to. Is the font size OK for the folks in the back? Good? OK. So let me go ahead and deploy my flow. I want to deploy version 2. I know that, again, from looking at NiFi Registry, seeing that it's on version 2. I can also go back to my NiFi. If I hover on that green check mark, it tells me that I'm currently tracking on version 2 here. So there's a couple ways you can confirm what version you want to go out. I'm going to deploy version 2 to staging. So this script runs pretty quick, and in just a second, we should have a success message indicating that staging's at version 2. OK. So you see staging was at version 1. It's now at version 2. Let me switch over to my staging environment, and this is where I'm going to do just some verification that everything's working as I expect. All right, so here I am at staging. It's pretty similar to my development environment with one very important difference, and that's where the source data is coming from, right? So I've got an input port here. It's labeled from production. That's actually telling me that data is coming in from production. I can verify that my flow was deployed. OK, it says it's now at version 2. So I know it's the right version here. And I want to just verify that everything's working as expected. Let me quickly show you how I achieved this. So what I wanted to do in my staging environment was get as close to production as possible to try to catch any issues with my flow before I deploy it to production. So I used a feature in NiFi called Sitetosite, or remote processing groups, to actually, in my production environment, where I have my flow running, it's pulling event data in, and the first thing that it does is it forks that data to go down the processing path, but also it's sending the data down another path. Let me refresh the canvas here. That's actually going over site to site. It's sampling it, and it's sending it to my staging instance. Chrome is struggling right now with the memory on my laptop. OK, so now this is not adding a lot of overhead to my production instance. When I fork the data right here and it goes to those two output queues, I'm not actually duplicating the data. We're using a flow file content repository on disk, and because the data is the same, I'm just passing the metadata and the ID referencing the data down this alternate path. I'm then taking a sample. It's doing a 1 in 100 sample. And I'm also scrubbing any PII from my data because, while that's fine in production, I don't want to give the developers that are using the staging environment for testing necessarily access to any PII. So I'm doing some anonymization, and then that's going to this staging output port. So that's actually sending data out. You can use a TCP or HTTP protocol to send data from one NiFi instance to another. So essentially, I've just tapped my production data flow here and sent it over to a staging environment so that I can test my new flow on production data. It's pretty cool. I can actually disable, well, I'm not going to do that right now. We're going to keep moving along. But if you wanted to see the sampling, I could disable that output and see the difference in queue size from these two groups to see. Actually, you can see it right here. So this is sent 71 messages. And I've got in 600 messages here. So I'm doing about a 1 in 10 samples, about an order of magnitude difference there. So that's what I have coming into my staging environment. Now I want to verify that my flow is working. And I already see some signs that maybe it's not. OK, so what did I get wrong? I'm noticing some red flags. One is that the failure path has had 44 messages come in, whereas only 25 had gone to success. Those numbers were not that before I deployed the new version of my flow. I can also see some error messages here that might tell me why that's happening. So the bulletins coming out of that process group at the error level are telling me that messages are being routed to failure with a message, field country cannot be null. So maybe I got something wrong with that schema. I do know from the data set that I was using to test that there is a country column. And in my test data, which was a canned CSV file, I had populated the country code in every example. So it seems like if I look at some actual data here, maybe that's not the case. Let me go ahead and stop this and let some failures queue up here so I can verify that might be the issue. All right, so another great feature in NiFi, I can do a lot of troubleshooting right here in the UI. So if I look at this CSV file that failed, yeah, I can definitely see that some of the second column, which is the country code, it's not populated on every event. I do also see that my anonymization from production is working. All right, so let me go fix this in dev. That should be a pretty easy fix. I just need to make that field optional in my schema. But before I go back to dev and fix that bug, I do want to revert staging to the older version that was working well, right? Because that's a shared environment, and just because my flow is messing it up, I don't want to break it for other users. So I'm just going to run my script again, change the version back to 1, which I know because the output of the previous thing I ran told me what version it was at before my flow got deployed. I'm going to reset staging back to version 1. OK, that looks good. Go ahead. We're going to get to that in just a second. All right, let me finish this up, and then we'll dive into how I'm actually making all this work. All right, so back over to development. Remember, I was hard coding the schema here. So let me just update the configuration and change that. If you're not familiar with Avro, it's a pretty concise and easy way to specify schemas. So I have this field country. It's set to type string. I didn't specify that it could also be null. So I do have to stop this to change the configuration. And now this is editable, and I can say that country can be string or null. And that makes it optional in the Avro schema. Go ahead and set that. And start it again. Now I could do some more testing here in development to make sure that that's working well. I could change my test input, remove some country codes, and verify that. In the interest of time, I'm just going to say I did all that and deploy this back to staging. Now, first, I do need to, I made a change. I need to save another version of my flow. Fixed schema error. Now I have version 3 available. So I'm going to deploy version 3 back to staging. Again, I could go into staging and verify that this fixes the issue. So let me do that real quick. I can just check. Again, I am at version 3, so my deploy worked as I wanted it to. I'm going to start everything up again. And then I'm going to stop my error output path and just watch for a little bit to see if anything queues up in the failure route. Not seeing any failures queue up. And I did see some values go through success. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this to production. Version 3 to prod. So what you're seeing in this script are the steps that I would need to do manually if I wasn't using NiFi Registry and this script that I put together, right? So it's going to just do some basic checks, tell me what version I'm at, what version I'm going to. It's going to deploy the flow that updates all the components of the flow in the target instance to match the state that they're in NiFi Registry. And then it does a couple things that I would have to do manually, again, if I wasn't using NiFi Registry and this script, to enable any controller services that belong to the process group I'm updating, and then to start everything up. By default, the state components are in when you do a deployment or an update, don't change. So if that component already existed and it was already running, it would just stay running. But any new components, any new controller services I've added to my flow, any new processors or connections, they'll all be stopped until I go in to enable them. So this script just automates that process as well. I can check production and see that I'm running version 3 of the flow there, and everything looks good at this point. So the next thing I want to show you is what's going on with that script. You might be thinking, this looks pretty cool, we might be able to use this, but there's definitely some custom logic going on in that script there. So let me show you what that is. You might be thinking that it's big or complicated. It's really not. It's a bash script. It's 60 lines long. I can make this a little bit bigger. So it's really efficient. It's 60 lines of shell script. So this is not like some huge external tool that I'm using to manage my NiFi instance. This is just using what's native capabilities in NiFi and NiFi Registry, and one additional tool that I'm going to introduce to you now. So if you look at what's going on when I get to this deploy version routine, there's some invocations to another tool. It's the NiFi Toolkit CLI. This has been around since the last 2 versions of NiFi. So it got introduced along with the initial version of Registry. This is really designed to help bootstrap people in automating their SDLC type operations. So this is a command line interface that basically lets you script some operations around versioning in NiFi and NiFi Registry. So I've got a few commands here that I've scripted, and this script now knows how to do a deployment of this flow across environments. It's pretty easy. So I want to share some more about the CLI. The CLI itself, it's just a 40 megabyte download. You can get it at nifi.apache.org. So again, everything you would need to replicate this automation, right? It's like a 60-line shell script and a 40 megabyte download that runs on any JVM. So you could drop this in, and I was running it manually from the command line for demo purposes, right? But if you wanted to, this is really easy technology that you could integrate into the server you're using with Jenkins or Ansible, Chef, Puppet, Salt, Rundeck, wherever you're doing your deployments for other parts of your infrastructure. You could write scripts like this, make a Rundeck job out of it, let anybody who has access to that run these jobs. You could turn my command line arguments for version and target environment into parameters that you wire into those sorts of tools, right? You could script this from an Ansible playbook or a Chef recipe and things like that. So the CLI is what makes this really easy, right? The reason I'm able to do all this in just 60 lines of bash, including comments and whitespace and new lines, is because of this tool that is the NiFi Command Line Interface. So I'm calling it with arguments, which means it's just going to execute it as a shell process and return. But if I invoke it right now without any arguments, it's going to drop me into an interactive shell. So if I want to play around with things and learn how to do this automation, this is a great way to do that. So NiFi toolkit bin CLI. Again, if I don't pass it any arguments, it drops me into a shell. This shell is really nice. Shout out to Brian Bendy in the NiFi team who did the vast majority of this work, like almost all of it. So this shell, it has tab completion. It's got a whole bunch of commands built in. First argument is what system I'm targeting. Is it a NiFi instance or a registry instance? And then there's an operation I can perform. So for instance, let's look at like registry list buckets. And I'll call help on that to see what I need to give it. So you get usage for everything. This is really great for interactive when you're new to the tool and you want to know what the capabilities are that are built in. It's abstracting, by the way. All this information is going to come from the REST APIs on these services. So one of the things I need to specify is the URL of the service that I'm calling for the REST. So let me go ahead and give it that. OK, and there's the two buckets that are on my registry instance. So that's information. I could then drill into those buckets, see what flows are there, see what versions exist of each flow. And you might be thinking, this is really nice, but that looks like it's going to be a bear to parse in an automated fashion. There's also another output type for JSON where I get the raw REST API response back. So a lot of thought went into this. It's designed to be really user-friendly, developer-friendly, and it's putting everything in your hands to get off the ground really quickly and start taking some of your workflows for SDLC and automating them. So this is a great output. I could pipe this into a command line tool like JQ, take parameters out of that, and use them in a larger orchestration script. And that's what I've done. So you might be thinking at this point, this all looks good. I've got NiFi and NiFi Registry, some tools for automation, if I'm interested in that, continuous deployments, or automatable, DevOps-friendly procedures for deploying my flows. You might be thinking at this point, it sounds like I need to have all my NiFi instances hooked up to the same NiFi registry for this to work, and that's definitely not the case. That's just one example scenario. It's what I used here. You may be thinking, if I go back over to PowerPoint, that in your organization, they're going to want to see something more like this, where you have a NiFi registry in production that's also separated from the NiFi registry instance running in your non-production environments. So if you're thinking, yeah, this is more my speed or my organization speed, my first question would be, I might challenge that a little bit. I might ask why. A couple things to point out. NiFi registry, it's not on the critical path for any of your data flow processing, right? It's only used when you do those operations like save new version, update process group to new version. Outside of those times, when you're doing deployments or when you're in development saving new versions, it doesn't interact with your data flow at all, right? So I could take my NiFi registry instance offline right now. All my production data is still flowing. The NiFi instance will know that it lost connection with its registry. So the status icons it gives you, like the green check marks or local changes, those will go away because it doesn't know. But other than that, that's just a UI thing. There's no impact to the actual data flow. So it's just something to think about. You also might think about where you are using other things that cross production and non-production environments. Do you have any Git repositories? Do you have any Nexus repositories? Again, that's the analog that really for what NiFi registry is. It's just storing those artifacts to make them more portable. So if you can be OK with it, it might simplify things a lot if you can have multiple environments pointing to the same NiFi registry. But if you can't, there's some tools built into this NiFi CLI. You might have noticed them when they were up on the screen earlier, but there's a export flow version and import flow version. So I can actually move my persisted flows from one registry instance to another. Again, when you're new to the CLI, coming into this shell and playing with it is a great way to learn how to write these commands. But once you have them, you just copy and paste them and run them from the command line. And that's what I've done here. So I have, excuse me, I have some commands that I copy and pasted and learned how to do in the shell, and I'm going to run them now. And I have an empty version of NiFi Registry that doesn't have any flows in it. That's what it looks like, pristine NiFi Registry, no flows saved. And I'm going to copy this flow that I have 3 versions in now over to that NiFi Registry instance. So I have the code to do that. I'm going to take a couple seconds to run. It's pulling data down from the first registry, serializing it to a format that's portable. It's a JSON format. We can actually look at that if anybody's interested. And it's going to import that back up to my new NiFi registry. So if I go over here and refresh, there it is. So you do have a way, if you want to run a registry per environment, that you could even script moving these persisted artifacts from one NiFi registry to another. Something else that's cool, this is actually registry 0.2. It just got released this week. The announcement's going to go out today. And it has a new feature for Git-based persistence with remote pushing, syncing to a remote repository. So that's what's happening on this instance. If I go over to my GitHub repository and refresh that, I can see I now have the same demo bucket with my process event logs flow saved here. This is that portable format I was talking about. It's JSON. So I actually now have a copy of my flow in 3 places: the original non-production registry, my production registry, and a copy on a GitHub instance that was pushed to that. So we're getting a lot of the benefits of distributed version control right here. It'd be really hard for me to completely lose this work because it's in so many places. And while all the tools aren't built in integrations, this is very new. NiFi Registry was just released in January of this year. We already have all this available, and hopefully you can see we're trying to put the tools in your hands and the community's hands to see what comes out of this. From here, you could see a path forward where people build other integration tools with those deployment tools I mentioned earlier, integrations with things like GitHub, so to enable a lot of flexibility and portability for your flows. That's all I had for the demo. So we've got about 10 minutes left, maybe a little less, and wanted to throw up some quick summaries, takeaways, best practices. Covered a lot of stuff, so this is a good summary if I breeze past that and you're still catching up. Use process groups. They are the granularity at which you can version things to NiFi Registry. Version them. Create versions every time you think you have a good state that you want to save and get back to at any point, or something you want to deploy. Get creative with site-to-site and remote process groups. It's a really good way to get test data from one environment into another, in addition to all the other great things it enables in NiFi. Use registry buckets for organization. You can organize your flows across teams, across domains. Use labels on the canvas for comments and collaboration. So if you're making a change to a flow and somebody else is going to be working on that flow, you might want to leave some labels on the canvas or comments on the processors to explain your thinking. For continuous deployment or automated deployments, avoid changes in adjacent versions that would require some manual intervention, such as removing connections. You could do that in a future version, right? In my example, now that I don't have any other data going down that deprecated flow path, I could now go in, delete all those processors, connections, clean it up, because I know the next time that gets deployed, they're going to be empty, and it's safe to remove them from the canvas just to tidy up behind myself. Same way you might make like a database schema migration to add a table rather than disrupting an existing table. And then automation, there's lots of tools that are already out there. I've covered a few. Command line interface. I didn't really get to this one, but if the command line interface and its built-in 30 or so functions for operations aren't enough for you, you can drop into something like NiPyApi. And this is a wrapper. It's a Python module, so it integrates with a lot of the tools I mentioned, Ansible, Salt, things like that, really easily. And it's basically a client SDK for the full REST API of NiFi and NiFi Registry. It's supported by the community. Most of the work's been done by Dan Chafelson, so shout out to him. And then if that's not enough, if even those sorts of tools aren't good or you don't want to work in Python, the REST APIs on NiFi and NiFi Registry really let you automate anything you could do manually through the UI. It might have a higher learning curve, higher bar to entry, but if you're willing to put in the work, you can do it. There's things to help you along the way. There's good documentation. NiFi Registry, for instance, has a Swagger UI, so you can look at the REST API this way, come in and interact with it. NiFi Registry has great REST API documentation. You can fire up developer tools in your browser while you use the UI. If you do something like commit flow version, you can see what REST API calls are made to NiFi Registry to make that happen. Yeah, so my suggestion is just think outside the box, go get creative, use these tools, figure out what you can automate. If you're doing the same manual steps that take half a day every time you do a deployment, chances are you could save yourself a lot of time and reduce errors from human mistake. So we've got about 5 minutes left. Any questions?
Yes, the CLI, is there anything planned similar for NiFi or anything like that?
A lot of these tools are being developed at different timelines and phases. You can kind of see the vision where all these things start to converge and come together. So, what I just covered was deploying flows from one NiFi instance to another. Because for NiFi Java, for instance, you can run flows that were built on a regular NiFi instance. You could see where there might be some chance to bring all these things together. We're not quite there yet, but ideas for the best way to sort of unify the experience across NiFi and NiFi with tools like this are being discussed. Mm-hmm. Yes. Sure. Great question. So basically, everything you would have to do manually to make those same set of changes from the diff in the flow versions, it's just automated for you. So the mechanics are, NiFi pulls down the version that you're targeting to upgrade. It looks at the diff. It calculates and looks at a diff between that version and the version that it's on. And then it sequences things in the right order so that it can make the changes with as few stops and starts or interruptions to the flow as possible. So basically, for an example, if you added a processor and created a new connection, it's going to do the right sequence so it knows the first thing I need to do to alter the state of the running flow is create that processor. Then I can create the connection. Right? It does everything in a deterministic order that makes it very likely it can upgrade with your flow running, with data moving, just getting rerouted as the flow changes, as if you were doing it on the canvas. Yeah? The question was best practices for different configuration properties in processors. OK, so most properties are going to get versioned with your flow. A couple exceptions to that. So don't have to think about it too much, because if I'm making a change, it's going to get versioned with the flow. When the flow gets deployed, the properties also get deployed with it. Yes. So there's a lot to pack into a 40-minute time slot, but there's something else that's a really good complementary topic to this topic. If you're not familiar with it, it's called variable registry. It's basically environment variables for NiFi. So same way we solve this problem with other tools, NiFi has the same solution, which is you can set environment-specific variables. They are matched on key, and then in each environment, you can set a different value. This is great for things like credentials, database connection URLs, Kafka topics or connection URLs, things of that nature which are specific to my environment. And they're scoped to the process group. So the way that works is you just right-click on a process group, and you can go to variables, and this is where I can create those things. When I save a flow, the defaults from the instance, the values that were on the instance I'm saving from get saved as defaults, but then they can be overridden in the environment, and they don't change the environment variables on import. All right, I think that's all our time. I'm willing to stick around, in this room if nobody's after us, or out in the hallway. If you have more questions, I can show you more stuff on my laptop, like variable registry, but I do want to get out of here so that the next talk can get started on time. Thanks, everybody.